This is The Baseline, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Welcome, everybody. You're tuned to The Baseline. Cal Lee Warrenshaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Tis the season. Greetings time for us to get it on and popping, man. We're getting a little bit closer to those unprecedented, always talked about, never forgotten Christmas Day games. The festivities of the holidays and being with your loved ones and, watching people, pretty much getting dunked on or seeing some marquee matchups throughout the course of Christmas night, man. So, for those of us who love basketball, Christmas is coming a little bit early for y'all because everything is heating up and is looking really good as we start moving towards the brand new year. But hey, man, even while things are brand new, you got to still have the same old, same old. Let me go ahead and roll out the red carpet to my right-hand man, www.shawsports.net, Big Kahuna PNC, my man, Mr. Warren Shaw, repping out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. What's good, my man? Hey, I wanted to give you props because you've been blowing up the Insta sphere, the Insta space with you and your lovely wife, man. You're like the next Beyonce and Jay-Z, all black everything. I'm on it. What's it like to be like, you know what I'm saying? Like one of the what do they have? People's Magazine sexiest man alive. What's it like to be, you know what I'm saying? Instagram's, sexiest podcaster in the
if there was such a category, I'm only elevated by my lovely wife. Ironically, a lot of thirsty folks like commenting on my wife's part of it as well too, more than anything else, which is fine. But it's really
dehydrated, man. They're a little dehydrated. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's good though. But my wife is a baddie, and I recognize that as well too. But we actually had a amazing time, and it's great to be able to post those pictures and kind of show the time that we had, and even the choreography of some of those photos were her ideation. I'm just along for the ride, and they're like, yeah, she's making you look good. And I was like, and yeah, she does. So
you added to the atmosphere, my friend. Don't sell yourself short. You know what I'm saying?
Listen, you and I, we go back a long way, and we both like to be clean, where we can, what I mean? We both have our little bit of swag, and, I take some of my, my fashion cues, from the great, Game Face Lee. So, you know what I mean? I'm out here just trying to do what I can do, but definitely my wife was the one, championing that cause when we were out there in Jamaica, man. A lot of fun. So check out the IG at Shaw Sports.
Absolutely. Shout outs to wifey, man, making the brothers look good. You know what I'm saying? It can only do so much. We got to step in. We got to make sure we fill in the shoes, right?
Yeah, you can't be looking like trash on the side. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we just got to try a little something.
Apart from that, I'd liken it to our experiences, when we were gallivanting around the Caribbean and stuff like that. We picked up on a few things. So maybe, maybe the significant others and,
we are men of style and leisure.
They've seen the potential, right? Anyway, so listen, man, we got a great show on tap. We're going to be talking about really one of the hottest teams that is just, lighting it up. And that be the New Orleans Pelicans, dare I say. I know you're a believer of them. You've been talking about it. It's been coming. Can they finally actually hold on to this firm footing they've been putting on right now as displaying themselves among one of the best teams? We will get into that conversation. And then obviously, what the landscape of the Western Conference is going to be like now that the New Orleans Pelicans have added themselves into the mix. They have, quote unquote, entered themselves into the chat. So we'll definitely talk about them in today's show. As always, be sure to get my man Shaw at Shaw Sports NBA. Get at me at Game Face Lee, the show's Twitter handle, NBA Baseline, available on all the major platforms. You know where to find us. If you want to catch this episode and all of our episodes, we encourage you to go to www.thebaselinenba.com. And as you're on using whatever platform you use your podcast, just put the baseline in, add us on, and you will see us come up so you can kick back, relax, and allow us to be your go-to resource discussing all things happening in the association. Now, if you are a listener of sports or you're a listener of culture, entertainment, music, politics, comedy, whatever your pleasure, we encourage you guys as well to roll with the 19 Media Group family. Baseline runs with the 19 Media Group, so go to www.19mediagroup.com so you can catch our show and the plethora of great quality shows that are out there. 19 Media Group be running these content streets, so get up on it because you will not be disappointed in all of the great stuff that we have on that platform. All right, so With that being said, in our segment of the breakdown, we're going to be talking about the New Orleans Pelicans. Before we do that, Shaw, I really wanted to get your take as we're recording this podcast the other night, the big marquee matchup that took place with the Golden State Warriors and the Boston Celtics. And I wanted to get your perspective on it real quick. Do you think of it as a nothing burger given the way that the Boston Celtics um, lost that game the other night? Or do you take it, for what it is? That as much as we are applauding how dominant the Boston Celtics have looked the early outset of the season, this is an outliner or maybe a marker for us to remind ourselves of how cautious we have to be in buying into the hype. Because ultimately, what it comes down to is that if the Warriors can prove they can be who they are when they need to be, quote, proverbial flip that switch, so to speak, does that say more about how the Celtics still have some growing up to do?
Boston has a long way to go still. It's early in the season. They're, kicking ass, taking names in the early part of it. But, it was a game, and I know Tatum shrugged it off. I think if they would have won, it's one of those things. Again, you got to say the right things publicly, but privately that burns them up that they lost and they didn't play well. I think it is truth indicative of Golden State. They rested up, leading up to that game. They tipped the game against Utah off in preparation so that they knew they were going to give their best effort against, the Boston Celtics coming into their arena. So to me, it's one of those, again, you can't win the championship in December. And I recognize that as well. But it is something that I think from a measuring stick standpoint, the Celtics are probably a little bit disappointed that it didn't go they want. And not just because it was another game. They didn't shoot the basketball well. Tatum still struggled. So you want to make sure that you can exercise some of those demons. So whenever they play them next, I believe it's MLK, they want to make sure that they can have a better showing against, when they play them in TD Garden. Otherwise, it does kind of like have some lingering effect to some degree, if they were to be in the finals. And we're a long way away from all of those things. Both teams have a lot to overcome in their respective conferences before we can talk about finals rematching. But it isn't exactly a nothing burger, but I wouldn't say, it's a full encore, full entree and full course meal here, where the Celtics need to be diving into and feel like they have all kinds of problems. But it was something that in essence they should be mindful of.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that the one thing that really stood out to me, and I think back to some of the rivalries that have come from these type of matchups at the early outs of the season. I think about the Warriors and the Cleveland Cavaliers. I think about the Clippers when they've played against the San Antonio Spurs, or the Clippers when they've played the Houston Rockets. And I don't think too much about what the regular season typically dictates, because there's always something that's going on, an injury, this, that, and the third. But I look more so at the mentality and the mindset. And I can clearly recall, if I harken back on those times when the Warriors played the Cleveland Cavaliers, I always looked at Klay Thompson as my outlier about how important that game was really to the Golden State Warriors. I never looked at Draymond, I never looked at Steph. I looked at Klay, because I think at that time, Klay to me was kind of the quiet voice in the room that spoke, and everything resonated through the way that his expression, how he expressed himself in the post game conferences, how he played out on the court and everything like that. That if that game meant something to him, it had to mean something to the rest of those guys. And if he came out and he said we played like trash defensively, he came out and said something to the effect of we need to be better, it was because he took that game to heart. And I liken that to saying, where are we going to see that at times from the Boston Celtics? I would have thought that it probably would come from Jaylen Brown. But I think it probably needs to come from Jason Tatum. I think it needs to come from him, that he needs to be pissed off that he just doesn't perform well against the Golden State Warriors. And while that's just one team, and he comes out and he arguably, looks like an MVP player to all of the other 29 teams in the, 28 teams in the NBA, the problem that I have with him is he needs to show that when it matters the most. You want to win the MVP? You got to step up on these primetime marquee games and really show people how awesome of a player you are, how dangerous of a player you are, how you should be entered into that conversation with anyone else that's in that. And I'm not saying that this is like going to end his bid to be MVP or whatever the case may be. I'm just saying that sometimes when you see these type of games, and as much as they play it down, I do often wonder the undertone of how they really take that game to heart, because
Yeah.
it is the defending champions, and it is a team that you eventually are going to have to measure yourself up to if you're going to talk about greatness and something dynastic with the combination that you have with Jaylen Brown.
Yeah, the only thing that, well, there's a lot to uncover, I think, potentially with it, but I think without Golden State having Wiggins in the game too, who obviously caused Tatum all types of fits. So the fact that he wasn't then able to overcome that, now that they didn't have the primary defender that really gave him all the problems in the finals, I think is a little bit, troublesome, to so to speak. But Golden State just game plan, they threw different looks at him, and it was difficult. I think also you're looking at it from the Boston standpoint, where you're an improved roster. You weren't able to pick up your guy here,
He didn't have
on
his
the
best
road,
night. Yeah, when he didn't have
right?
his
When he
best
didn't have everything going for him, you weren't able to kind of get it done. So it wasn't a particularly special defensive effort. The three ball failed them, and it's just one of those things. It happens in NBA games where you're not always going to be able to shoot, 40%. But I think it's something crazy. Like the Celtics have three of the top five guys in 3-point per shooting, and they all were off. You know what I mean? Derek White, Grant Williams, and Malcolm Brogdon. Brogdon played a good game, floor game statistically, but he didn't, he wasn't his season self from the 3-point line. So that was the biggest issue. Then had some bouts with turnovers here and there, but I think, Golden State, you're looking from their lens, they still have that championship medal and grit. And they were able to kind of get it done when the lights were the brightest, so far here in the regular season. And I think that's why you still have to be very, very cognizant of them in the Western Conference.
Absolutely. All right, we'll not belabor you guys any further, but we are interested in what your personal take is when it comes to the Boston Celtics, the Golden State Warriors. Golden State Warriors obviously have struggled in the early outset of this season. They're basically like on the outside looking in, literally, when you're talking about the playoff picture. But how much confidence do you have now after seeing what they did the other night against the Boston Celtics? Does that increase your confidence that you are going to see them among the teams, regardless of where they situate themselves in the playoffs? And if you're the Boston Celtics, regardless how high up the food chain they sit, do you think that they're as good as what they reflected last year in that second half run, getting themselves all the way up into the NBA Finals? Do you still see them head and shoulders better than the rest of the other teams that are out there in the Eastern Conference? We definitely want to hear from you. So be sure to get at us at NBA Baseline. All right, coming up, Sean and I are going to break down the hottest team in the Western Conference and arguably in the NBA, and that is the New Orleans Pelicans. Hey, man, fly Pelicans fly. How high they go up, nobody knows. We're going to be talking about how good this ascension is and if you should buy into the hype of the New Orleans Pelicans being one of the best, if at least the most dangerous team out there in the NBA. Coming up here on the Baseline. Time to break it down. To the bone gristle. Time now for the breakdown. Lee Warren Shaw, Baseline NBA podcast. And our topic for the breakdown, one of the hottest teams right now in the NBA, as we were recording this podcast, the New Orleans Pelicans up 17, only down 8 in the loss column as far as win totals go. And they are one of the hottest teams that is out there. On both sides of the basketball, you're seeing a team that is really flexing its muscles, so to speak. Now, whether or not this is, viable for a whole NBA season, and at some point you're waiting for the shoe to drop, and maybe this is all fugazi, I don't know. But Shaw, when you talk about a team that isn't afraid to be who they are, we talked about this a few years ago with the Phoenix Suns, with Monty Williams being under the helm, and we're talking about this now with Willie Green, and there's no little short sample size to look at this. This seems to be an extensive reflection of the grit and grind mentality that Willie Green exhibited when he was a role player for numerous teams, more poignantly when he played for the Philadelphia 76ers. You're seeing his imprint on this team, but this team in and of itself exhibits a level of versatility that even I can say that I'm very surprised by, and it's ascended them to be one of the top teams in the Western Conference.
I think the thing that I'm most impressed by, in New Orleans is the fact that they've had Brandon Ingram miss, 10 games of their season thus far, right? He's only played in 15 games as we record. And they're still kind of getting it done. McCollum has been out. Even Zion's missed a couple of games, but they truly have a roster that allows them a certain level of flexibility. Strength of schedule, I think, is in the middle-ish. There's like 17th, 18th in terms of strength of schedule. So some of that can be attributed to some of that, maybe some of the teams they've played against. But ultimately they've been able to plug and play, and different guys have been able to kind of get it done. Trey Murphy has been playing good basketball for them. Herb Jones played good basketball for them, been in our lineup as well too. Alvarado has played well for them. It's just really, really amazing to see that Larry Nance has spelt Zion in the times that he's been out, and Ingram in the times that he's been out as well. And I think it all, as you alluded to, is really important to kind of set it back to what Willie Green has been able to do, setting this team with defensive principles, currently third in defensive rating, but offensively they're also sixth as well. So top 10 in both offense and defense, and just outside the top five in both of those things with being sixth offensively. This Pelicans team is really, really, really scary. And while I don't think they'll be the first team, as we record here, they're first in the Western Conference, and that's like by half a game or something like that now. The West is really jumbled. I did predict this team to be fighting for home court advantage, and I think that's a very, very real possibility for New Orleans going into this. Zion is getting back to the Zion. He looked a little shaky to begin the year. I mean, there was some points it was like, all right, he's, scoring 12 or whatever the case would be, or not really shooting it all that well. But since Ingram has gone out, he's like, yeah, I got it. So to know the fact that they can win either way, I think is proof positive of the type of talent that this Pelican team has, but more importantly, the coaching acumen of Willie Green on the sidelines.
So I want to break this down in a couple of different segments, so to speak, and hopefully it'll all kind of culminate to what I think the bigger question is going to be is, is this a contender type of team that we can see already in the early outset? So I understand that you brought up the point about Brandon Ingram not being there, and now we are seeing quote unquote the rise of Zion, right? He's coming, like he's building up, right? I think the bigger question that I have for you, Shaw, is where is your confidence level in Zion Williamson's defensive tenacity? I think this team has really stepped itself up collectively to be better defensively.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes, and we often talk about this, the team defensively is only as good as when your leaders go out there and show you what it's like to play that type of defense, right? Now, I'm not saying Zion Williamson got to be playing the best players on the opposite end. He's got to be defending them. But what I think I'm talking about is that, to your point, Zion's willingness to defend and willingness to command some type of level of intimidation in the paint area, I think has lended itself to us really buying into how good the Pelicans can truly be, not just from what they're getting from their guard play, but extensively on both sides of the ball, what they're getting from their front court play as well, too.
Yeah, and I think I would even want to, be better informed and watch a little closer on that side of the basketball. I think from what I have garnered is that schematically, Green has been able to utilize Zion and capitalize on matchups where he's not going to be exploited. Obviously, Zion is extremely physical, and so he can utilize that too. But where I've seen, and it's what makes highlights, obviously, is his splashy blocks. You know what I mean? Or him running in the lane and maybe in creating a steal or what the case to be. But you want to see what is his on-ball defense? What is his help side defense? And it's not just about throwing the ball into the stands after getting a block. It's like, okay, can you control or really just defend base level close out? And I think some of those things we're not seeing in terms of what's making the highlights, but they're happening from a rotational standpoint that's allowed Zion to have a little bit better yield defensively and being the guy to some degree that we hoped he could be. Right now with the defensive rating of 110, so you take that, his offensive rating of 124, that's a plus 16, on that side of the basketball, then you realize, okay, he's not and that's not has nothing to do with his plus minus, but again, you realize he's not a net negative out there, especially not a defensive liability, especially with the other guys that are around him as well too. So I think with Ingram, sneaky decent defender, especially when he's given that level of effort because of how long he is. But to not have Ingram out there for 10 games, a lot has been put more on Zion. You have Valanciunas as well too, who is a pseudo/rim protector, but he's not like Brook Lopez out there, and he's not really contesting jumpers and things like that too. So situationally, they're getting a lot of great help from them. Alvarado obviously is a defensive pest, and I think the defensive collective is making everybody's defensive rating and numbers go up a little bit, inclusive of Zion.
One of the things that I appreciate about what I'm seeing from the New Orleans Pelicans is that they're not going to overwhelm you with what we typically get from the quote unquote contenders for defensive player of the year, type performances, right? Like what you normally see from Rudy Gobert, what you probably see from Anthony Davis, what you typically will see even say from Marcus Smart, right? A lot of what has projected them into that conversation for defensive player of the year is there what they stick to. There is some kind of analytic or number that really sticks out amongst what makes them unique, right? What I appreciate is that this team has a more a team oriented defensive tenacity about them that you can make the argument. All of these guys right now, I'm just only talking about, as they are currently in their ride of their hot streak. But right now, they're collectively doing the things that supplements or accentuates what their offense is giving them. It's like they're putting themselves in the best position to come out and execute the way that they do offensively for a team who typically you're always reminiscent of. It's what they do in the half court because they never have any
Mhm.
good transition. It's typically what they do in a set play when they get a key defensive stop and are now out on the run. They've picked the pace up. They're one of the 12th best in the NBA right now when it comes to their pace. But I also think about that along the lines of how do you help dictate that pace when you're typically a half court oriented team where you got guys that look like they are half court oriented, but you see that these guys want to get out and run. The Jose Alvarados of the world love to get out and run. They do something defensively. They don't even bother to look back and figure out if whether or not they still got the ball. They're already leaking out. And you're seeing how they're taking advantage of that with other teams. It seems like teams are a step slower the moment the Pelicans make a defensive stand against them.
Yeah, and I'll point to two things that really stand out to me that support what you're talking about is the fact that they are second in defending the three, and they're fourth in terms of turning people over. So averaging, teams against them are averaging 16 turnovers a game. So you're right, they are getting out there and forcing those turnovers and, effectively stopping the 3-point line, you know what I mean? And having people miss from that where there's so much value and, value placed on that right now. So I think New Orleans is in a space where, as you alluded to, collectively, they're making it and getting it done defensively. And that really is kind of speaking to the larger initiative. And I think we started to see some of that last year towards the tail end of it, with Willie Green and then even getting McCollum as well, too. While he's not a defensive guy, you need somebody to kind of help galvanize that team and another kind of grown up in the room. And I think that has really, really made a huge difference because McCollum can be the on court and kind of even spiritual leader and be an extension of what Willie Green wants on the sidelines as well. So this is a team that is really kind of putting it together. And we can, I don't know how deep we want to go into it, but I think even a guy like Valanciunas, like, hey, he picks his spots and he knows now that Zion is back and presumably healthy, that he's not going to get to eat as much. And he has to be okay with that because it's resulting in winning. Even McCollum to a lesser degree. He's like, all right, I can't come out here and be Dame Chucker number two, like even kind of how he was in Portland. Like, hey, there's other guys here who really need to eat and need to get the basketball. So McCollum is essentially the starting point guard, which is a role that I think we've all questioned whether or not he could do or do consistently at a high level. I think in a pinch, you're like, all right, sure, but he's really being McCollum has brought to this team. I'm excited for what New Orleans is been able to accomplish thus far. Now you just got to see is like, can they maintain it? Because the Western Conference is still very, very tough.
Yeah, the Western Conference is live and thriving, but I think you can make the argument that this type of team that's structured has a good front court, back court balance to them, where the players you can tell are complementary of each other. Now, does that equate to them automatically going out and winning games? Some of the things I've hearkened on, Shaw, and then maybe I'll speak at it ad nauseum. It's all about how you're approaching the game intellectually on a level where you can impose your will of what you do best against those other teams, right? Like making them having to change the way that they play and adjust to you because you're going out and you're going to execute. I think to me, that's one of the keys to what we were speaking about a little bit earlier before when it came to the Boston Celtics and about when you're playing against a team like the Golden State Warriors, win or lose. It's not so much whether or not you've gone out and you've played like this awe-inspiring game, or and you're making it a classic. I think if you're as good as you've always been, or as you say you are, it's gonna be a classic game because you're gonna force the Golden State Warriors to play to the highest level, right? And you can take out all of the other excuses that we normally implement in the regular season why some of these games don't live up to that standard. But what I'm saying is that at some point, your level of intellect of how you're applying yourself into this game, how your team is applying itself into this game, how your coaches
Mhm.
are applying itself into this game has an impact on whether or not people are going to buy into this is sustainable throughout the course of the regular season, or it's just pie in the sky. And I'm thinking that this is where we could possibly see the Pelicans turning that corner. You know what I'm saying, Shaw? Like, it was easy to buy into it a few years ago when you had Anthony Davis, because Anthony Davis was the best player on the court. But when you really looked at the parts that comprise that team, it's Drew Holiday, Rajon Rondo, Anthony Davis. That's it. No one else, to your point, is eating. No one else is stepping up. No one is thriving from this. Everyone is just kind of going along for the ride. But now with this team, man, we're seeing certain, and we're mentioning them, the Larry Nances, the Jose Alvarados, you know what I'm saying? Herb Jones. These guys are coming in and they are all putting an imprint on helping this team to succeed. And Willie Green is finding ways to allow them to be able to do that. And that's very rare to be able to do in the climate of what we typically see in this NBA, simply because of all of the star power that's emanating, already the young star power that's already emanating in before our eyes.
Yeah, and what I want to also understand is, Jackson Hayes has been injured, hasn't really been there, and you look at their rosters like, all right, well, are they really weak anywhere? And I don't know that that's the case. Maybe they could utilize another shooter, maybe because you feel like, all right, Trey Murphy is giving them enough. McCollum should be able to give them enough there. Alvarado isn't really a scorer here or a shooter in that regard. So if you were going to do one thing,
Watch
but
out
I
now.
mean,
he dropped that 38, man. He might tell you
he's
he
a
might tell
hooper,
you
right?
otherwise.
So I mean, and then even to a lesser degree, Devonte Graham is a guy who can shoot the three ball. I know he's definitely regressed from
We
a
didn't
couple
even
years
mention
ago. So, I think like, they don't have a lot of major weaknesses, because even if you're going to say, well, you bring Hayes back, and you still have Nance, who can basically play a small ball five for you, which is more modern, and he can shoot corner threes and all of those other things like that as well. So you'd really be nitpicking to kind of say they need X, Y, or Z. And I think the roster kind of works, especially once Ingram gets back. You have enough guys who can play create, especially with Zion, Ingram, and even McCollum, and then guys Alvarado and Graham coming off the bench as well too. So it really is a roster that fits. It fits the scheme and the culture and the identity that Willie Green wants specifically. And I'd be interested to see if they try to do anything around the margins. And the fact that this team could conceivably somehow maybe even get a draft pick, a lottery pick as a result of that Lakers trade, with Anthony Davis. I know the Lakers are playing better basketball now. It really just kind of show, hey man, David Griff, while a lot of people thought he was grifting, and kind of getting away with murder for a while, he's put it together, and I think he's rebounded nicely. And I think the Pelicans are a roster that we definitely have to recognize and understand that, hey, things are moving in a positive direction for them.
You're tuned to the Baseline. Callie Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Coming up, Shaw and I are going to look into whether or not this team is structured for sustainability, or are we looking at this as, is this the window for now as the New Orleans Pelicans with the way that this team is built? You'll find out what we say on that side of it here and more on the Baseline. We are back. Cal Lee Warren Shaw, Baseline NBA podcast, and our segment of the breakdown, as we have been talking about the New Orleans Pelicans, arguably one of the hottest teams right now that is just kicking ass and taking names. And I think where we left off, Shaw, was we are really like enamored with this roster because it's a unique roster, right? There seems to be balance. They've got shooting at the top end when you've got the combination of McCollum and Graham. You've got the front end, to your point, when they get back Ingram, and the dominance that you're seeing from Zion Williamson and the contributions they're getting from their role players and, Valanciunas and Nance and those guys. Collectively, you look at this team and you say there's everything that you feel like is exciting and is real. I guess the question that I really have about this is, when you look at this team and you look at this roster, because if we're going to be realistic, we're saying, is this team championship caliber, right? After what we've seen over the last few seasons, which has been a toss-up, right? The Golden State Warriors have resurrected themselves. We've seen the Milwaukee Bucks, who constantly are in that conversation. We often talk, and we see the Boston Celtics, who have suddenly now, they found it, right? Like they've gotten to the promised land. They just didn't find themselves, you know what I'm saying, hoisting a trophy at the end of it. We're talking about all of these teams, and with a good, when you look at them, a lot of them you're saying, damn, they've got components for the next 4 or 5 years that are giving you the confidence to say this is sustainable for what they're going to try to do. Can we say the same thing about the New Orleans Pelicans now that we see that Zion Williamson does want to stay in New Orleans? He wants to make this happen. Ingram is buying in. They're buying into Willie Green. Willie Green's all in, right? And David Griffin, clearly, we see the method to his madness now. Are we buying into the fact that we could put the Pelicans in that conversation of teams if this trends the way that it does, that they have a window for the next 3 to 5 years to be in a championship conversation? Do we have to wait and see how deep a run they could possibly make before buying into any level of upside that this team is capable of?
I mean, I think as we're talking here in, roughly mid-December, the answer to that is we'd probably want to see how the rest of this year plays itself out, right? And then do they ultimately decide, like, hey, we are a small move, a medium-sized move, a large move away from really being there, or are we there right now? But when it comes to the actual roster construction, your points are actually very valid, because at least they have, I say, 2 to 3 years of sustainability. Everybody's under contract, with the exception of Valanciunas, who expires next year. But McCollum signed a 2-year extension. Ingram is not done until 2025. Zion obviously signed the extension this past summer. So that core is very much in place for what you need it to be for some long-term viability. Now, you just hope that, McCollum doesn't fall off of a cliff. He'll be 33, 34-ish. And it depends. It hits every player differently.
We're talking about him being 33, 34, McCollum.
Say
And
that
I mean,
again?
he doesn't play like that, right? But we've been saying for the longest time, and we've said to ourselves, like, you wonder if whether or not the years playing next to Damian Lillard held back a lot of what potentially he could have kind of etched in his level of greatness in the game, so to speak, as not to being a sidekick, but actually being a harbinger, a forger, so to speak, for a team, for another team. Like, it's always made me kind of wonder about that, because I've always loved McCollum when he came out of college, and I did actually enjoy the combination that him and Damian Lillard brought together. But we often talk about how those are two alphas, and whether or not that was sustainable in the climate of that NBA at that time, because it was being dominated by the Golden State Warriors.
Yeah, so I think the role definement is different for CJ in New Orleans. While he doesn't have to be the guy who takes the most shots to be the leader. Dame was unquestioned leader in Portland, and took the most shots. I think CJ now is understanding and comfortable in himself, and he's obviously gotten the bag, so he's not really worried about making finances come together. But Zion and Ingram are really the present and future of this team by virtue of being in their 20s. So CJ is a guy who can be, an elder statesman and veteran who can still contribute at a high level, but doesn't necessarily have to, score 25 to 30 a night in essence to have the impact that he has. Again, we all know his work in the media space. We all know his work as, a member of the Players Association and being within that leadership and executive leadership at that. So he's taken that aspect of his basketball career and given that a certain level of professionalism, as I said, that can really help this Pelicans team thrive. So again, when it comes to overall sustainability, this is a team that, barring health, should be together and be, a problem for everybody in the NBA for at least the next 2, maybe even 3 years. Now, we talk 4 and 5 years out, McCollum's age starts to kind of come to question with that. And then again, what are the peripheral moves that you've made in the short term, to kind of go alongside Zion and Ingram. But anyways, I think, again, when you look at it totality, it's a very good roster. They hit a solid double that could turn to a home run, with the Herb Jones situation. I really like Trey Murphy as well too. And all those guys can only get better. You know what I mean? So it really is. It's definitely an upward hour here for the Pelicans here for the upcoming future.
I agree with you on all points, or on all fronts. There looks like there is certainly a lot of upside, and it's interesting too, Shaw. Typically, when we see teams and they're constructed, and you are looking at them, you're saying, Are they put together and you're just hoping to see if they are going to pan out and that there's some level of success, so at least you have an idea of where to work, where to move, what to move on, or what to do moving forward? Or do you have the confidence that with these guys, you know that they can improve, you know that they can, better their game in different aspects, and not so much as to what has been a weakness to them, but what it's going to take for them to put that team in a position to be championship caliber? I'm starting to see a little bit of that with Zion. I'm starting to see a little bit of that with Ingram. I would like to see what this combination can ultimately do. Now, a while back, Shaw, you and I, we've had these conversations, and we even amongst our circle of friends have who have bought into Zion Williamson. I've been a staunch believer that I don't think Zion Williamson should be the quote unquote leader, so to speak, like the voice of the team. I think the way that he goes about being that type of player to a team is exhibited on what he does on the basketball court, the level of dominance, the bully ball that he is capable of doing. I think if he continues to show true to himself in being that kind of way, he can quickly ascend himself in that MVP conversation very, very quickly. If he continues down that, if he starts messing around and he tries to start shooting the three and dancing around the perimeter and not really going full throttle like the way that we've seen Giannis over the last few years, full throttle go in and prove that he is among one of the most dominant players. Primetime games, go in there, bully the Joel Embiids, bully the Giannis Antetokounmpos. It makes me wonder whether or not, you say to yourself, hey, do the Pelicans, are they viable champions? Unless you see that out of him, because when you have the offset of that is seeing what Ingram can do. Ingram is kind of a baby, Durant. And it usually takes kind of an awakening for players like Ingram, who are versatile, who have so much levels to their game, but have never found that next level that it means to be a championship. Together, I think that those two guys can find within each other a combination very similar to what we're seeing with the Boston Celtics with Tatum and Brown. It may take a year or two to get to that point, but if they stay true to themselves within each other, bounce off each other, feed off of each other is the best way I should put it. This Pelicans team could be exactly what we're hoping to see happen with the Memphis Grizzlies having John Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr. And now my question to you, Shaw, is what you're seeing with the Pelicans, could they quickly ascend themselves? Could they leapfrog over what we were believing to see with the Memphis Grizzlies with Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr.?
I mean, I think that's extremely nuanced. There are obviously some folks, and I've even raised the question, it's like, hey, would you do the draft over again? Would you take Zion first or would you take Ja first now? Knowing what we know and obviously the injury history, Ja obviously has been more durable than Zion has, but Ja still had his own, battles with some injuries and being in and out of the lineup. Ja entered the MVP conversation last year, where Zion is still trying to do that, and he could potentially maybe do that this year. I think when you're doing the comparison of the two, all four of those guys, again, they have injuries. Like, Jaren Jackson hasn't had a clean bill of health in God knows how long. He started the season on the shelf this year, and Ingram is currently out as we record. So I think it's a great comparison, almost kind of, who you got type of mindset, if you will. But the fact that both of these teams play in the same division, if you will, and are now actually 1-2 in the Western Conference as we record here today, I think it really is something that is up for debate. And if I were taking one of the two, you just have more sweat equity, I think, with obviously the combination of the Memphis Grizzlies and having them gone to the semifinals and things like that. Like, we just know more about them currently, but the long-term prospect makes it a little bit more murky. And
Can I say something to your
they
point?
complement each other very differently as well.
Can I say something to your point about that? The reason why I probably would still lean on a Ja Morant is because I sense there is a level of hunger, of greatness in Ja Morant, more so yet than I've seen from Zion. I think Zion is just uber happy. He's in the NBA, and he's being looked upon like this freakish athlete. A little bit like how we talked about Dwight Howard in his early years playing with the Orlando Magic. It just comes naturally with what he does to be able to dominate a game. But I'm looking for that angry streak, or maybe that level of cockiness. Now, maybe we saw that the other night when he did that windmill dunk against the Phoenix Suns, that level of brashness. Like, I just don't give a what. You know what I'm saying? About
Well,
how and and I'm not saying I got to see it every single time. What I'm saying is I need to see it when it needs to speak and resonate with how we should be looking at this Pelicans team. I think the Pelicans want to feel like y'all keep disrespecting us because you don't think that we're real enough that we could be up there with these guys. And we've said this before. It's been one of the things that I've questioned about the Phoenix Suns, man. The Phoenix Suns are arguably one of the most consistently winnable teams that are out there in the NBA. But at the same time, they have also been the whipping boy for a lot of teams at the worst time possible. It's like it's hard for us to say the Phoenix Suns are champions when they get blown out by the Dallas Mavericks. It's hard to say that they're champions when they have things like what happened the other night against the New Orleans Pelicans. And I get it, they're regular season games, but I feel like it happens all too frequently, too much to them, when they were the ones that were actually doing it at the early outset when they got themselves to the NBA Finals that year, a couple of years ago. You know what I'm saying? They were basically putting it on teams that were unabashed by it. Now all of a sudden, teams are putting it on the Phoenix Suns, and everyone's like, whoa, what, what's going on? And and it's just strange to me how we speak of it in that kind of context. But if I see that in the New Orleans Pelicans, if I see that coming out of the mentality of a Zion Williamson and Ingram, oh, for sure, we should be talking about the Pelicans being a lively, viable contender, because to me, they're unabashed with how they're going to compete against the better teams, or arguably supposed to be the better teams against them.
Well, the only thing that I say in counter to that is I think if you're comparing it New Orleans to Memphis specifically, is Ja is the in question leader of the Memphis
Right,
Grizzlies,
right. No, absolutely.
and he's
Yes.
that guy. And then even with Jaren Jackson and Desmond Bain, right? So it's over like the trio of them are trying to take that team to that next level. Zion and Brandon Ingram are both lower key individuals, where CJ McCollum, as I alluded to earlier, is probably now the leader of the team, so to speak, and not just by virtue of play, but by virtue of voice in the locker room, where Ja is doing both roles on the court and kind of off the court. So, it's personality types, but Zion's also still very, very young and still has more NBA games to play and to learn. I think he's a very personable young man and individual that we may ultimately see evolve into that leadership role. So I think the short version of it is CJ should be holding that seat warm for him until he's ready to ascend, but they can still have a great amount of success as a team and roster until Zion's ready to assume that mantle, if he ever becomes ready. But Ja is already in that seat right now. And that's where I think the difference is between those two teams.
All right, Shaw, let's go ahead and finalize our thoughts about this New Orleans Pelicans team, the hottest team in the NBA and obviously in the Western Conference. By the time that we get to the NBA trade deadline, where do you see this team? Do you still see them among one of the top three teams in the Western Conference? Or are you arguably going to talk about how you can see them basically taking a dip and maybe falling back somewhere around the 4, 5, 6 range, maybe even the 7, 8, 9, 10 range? Like, where do you see this team by the time we get to the by NBA All-Star weekend? Let me put it like that before we talk about trade deadline.
Yeah, I think they'll be in the 4 or 5 range, and that's not a knock. I just think there's a lot of great teams in the Western Conference, and maybe some people are still trying to put it together. I mean, all it takes is a 2 or 3 game losing streak, and then you drop to 7, 8. You know what I mean? That's just like it's very, very close right now. So standing wise, it's almost irrelevant, so to speak. It's almost immaterial because they're just going to be so jumbled up that part of it is going to matter. I think you just want to well, where are they at offensively, defensively? What are the metrics telling us about how they're playing, and are they healthy? And I think their health will determine the amount or the types of moves that they make, if any, come trade deadline and around All-Star break. But I could see them maybe trying to go get into the Jay Crowder sweepstakes, and trying to figure that out and have him, be a guy who comes off the bench for them, in some capacity and be really, really helpful. Or do they just go out here and get another pure shooter, who can just come in and knock it down? Either way, whoever they bring in is going to have to play some level of defense at the top of it too. So I think this is a mid to high level Western Conference seed when all is said and done. But either way, once the playoff comes, you don't want you want no parts of this. Like, this is going to be a hard out for this Pelicans team, and they are really, really good.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that they may drop off a little bit, but I think that the gap between 1 and maybe 8 in the Western Conference is going to be so close. But I think that's exactly what you want. I really think that, I don't have a question about whether or not this team is a playoff caliber team. The way that you're getting the contributions from their role players, I think speaks volumes, and it creates a buffer. I can't speak how important it is to have a coach like Willie Green, who's been on that side of the fence where he's come off the bench and has played an important role, playing next to the Allen Iversons and the Carmelo Anthonys of the world during that generation, and still found his footing in being a relevant player for an extended period of time. How that resonates to the role players that the Pelicans typically have. Because honestly, with what you're expecting to have happen, and I think it's going to happen, the injuries are going to mount up, right? You just, teams this good, this is why you say to yourself, depth is so important. So if you have a coach that knows and understands his personnel from the start, the very first person you have coming out on that court to the guy that's sitting all the way at the end of the bench who's probably giving you maybe 5 minutes at best, or garbage time, during blowout games, he's going to find a way to get them to be ready and be prepared. Typically, coaches are resting their laurels on just the 8 guys that they want to run out there. But then what do you do once you lose about half of those guys? And I think that, to me, is the key of longevity. Willie Green understands that, and he's got the Pelicans. All of them are buying in. All of them are contributing. And to have that at the early outset of the season, I think bodes well. It provides a buffer for their superstars that they can, quote unquote, load manage or take necessary games off because he has confidence in the guys that he's going to come in to at least supplement or fill in so they can still be a complete competitive team. So to me, Shaw, they may taper off a little bit, but they're definitely going to be a top 5 team if they continue to trend in this kind of manner, being top 10 offensive, top 10 defensive. It's really hard to argue just how dangerous this team is collectively.
Well said, bro. So excited to see where the Pelicans finish off. But as we alluded to, fly Pelicans fly. Nice to see Zion being healthy. Hopefully Ingram can come back and complement, and they can figure out a way to work that. Because I think part of it, and I didn't want to get into it too deeply, but I'm still not convinced that the meshing of them when they're all playing plus minutes is where it probably is ultimately going to land for them to be successful, like they've gotten by. But Zion was the one who's basically been taking a back seat when Ingram was healthy to begin the year, and before Brandon Ingram took the back seat when Zion was having his best year. So can they find a way to meet in the middle, kind of like how have you alluded to Tatum and Brown have, where they're both getting their numbers, but it's not in this your turn my turn situation. So that'll be the next level of their evolution. But ultimately, right now, still nothing but positive things.
Absolutely, man. And I know that we're going to revisit this conversation as as the season continues further. We'll probably, do a dissection, look into that dynamic more between Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson. Me, again, I'm a firm believer that while I think Zion Williamson is definitely a superstar in this league, do I think that he should outright be the leader for a particular franchise? I'm not buying into it, because I think it takes away from the level of dominance that he can exhibit against the rest of those teams. And I think that should be his focus. Go out and dominate, and let all of the other ancillary things as far as leading a team kind of fall on with guys like McCollum and even with Ingram. Share that part of the load, because I think when he shows people how dominant he truly can be in this league right now, that resonates. That speaks intimidation. That speaks to other teams that you don't want no part of the Pels, simply because the quiet giant is out there on the basketball court and he going to do you nasty. And I think that's exactly the mentality that a good team should have, is not making players more than what they are until they're ready to step up and be that when the time presents itself. Awesome show altogether, Shaw, as always, man. And, hey, man, what can we say, man? Fly, Pelicans, fly.
Let him fly, bro. And excited to see where it all lands. Shouts to Willie Green. Love to get him on the show at one point. Might need to do some investigating, see if we can do that.
Oh, you do
But
that very
again,
well, my friend. You do that very well.
well, we'll see. We'll see what I'm able to pull out the magic hat. But I think ultimately, again, as they're making their stand in the Western Conference, it's nice to see that they are, at the top of the conference as we record, but definitely going to be a viable player throughout. So as always, man, great to do the show with you. Love to hear what our fans, listeners have to say about this. What are your thoughts on the New Orleans Pelicans? What are your thoughts on Zion, the Ingram dynamic? What's that's looking like, CJ, and what do they need potentially on the edges to improve? Would love to hear your thoughts, man. Holler at us on Twitter at NBA Baseline.
Absolutely. Once again, man, we'd like to thank you and yours. Oh, by the way, before I jump out, man, I got to give a special shout out to this group, Roots of Fight. If people don't know who they are, Roots of Fight is an apparel company They have specialized in doing some licensing deals with some of the most iconic people that have impacted sports altogether that we sometimes don't normally get to speak on. They've licensed agreements with Ken Griffey Jr., Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, and right now I'm rocking one of my favorite players. Shaw's knows this. I've been a Kevin Garnett fan for God only knows for so long. They Roots of Fight. They've got an apparel brand for Kevin Garnett, aka the Big Ticket. So I encourage you guys to go to www.rootsoffight.com. Go check it out, man. You will not be disappointed at some of the gear that's out there. It's one of the hottest stuff. If you go on Instagram and any of the other social media outlets, you'll see a lot of dudes rocking Roots of Fight. They've got some great stuff, man. And I can just encourage people to just say, you know what? Go out there and support the cause for those guys out there, those iconic players. Give them a platform as well, too, because they did a lot for the sports that you love, that you appreciate. And this is just another company that's giving another elevated platform for them for us to show that love in the situation. Go to www.rootsoffight.com. Once again, for the baseline, Cal Lee, Warren Shaw, we appreciate you guys. We'll talk to you soon. It's about that time. Jingle, jingle, Christmas kringle, baby. Christmas time coming around. You know we got a hot episode ready for you on that one. Catch up with you next time.